The door was ajar. It shouldn't have been. Officer Harris paused at the threshold, his breath shallow. The house smelled stale, like dust and something older, something sharper. He stepped inside, his boots scraping against the worn floorboards. A chill ran up his spine, but he couldn't tell if it was the temperature or something else. The hallway stretched before him, eerily silent. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely reached in. It left long shadows, crawling across the walls. His flashlight flickered. He paused, adjusting it. The beam landed on the faded wallpaper, peeling in places. The photos on the walls seemed to stare back. Harris didn't know why he was still here. He was just supposed to check in. The woman had been isolated. Her son, gone for years. But there had been reports. Strange ones. A voice, muffled through the phone. "I need help." Then silence. He had to come. He had to. Slowly, he crept toward the living room. The air grew heavier. His fingers tightened around the flashlight. The light shuddered and then steadied. And then he saw it. The couch. Cushions pushed back, like someone had been sitting there, but no one was. A blanket half-draped over the back. A single boot resting by the edge. It was wrong. His heart thudded. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, but it crackled, static, then silence. A distant sound echoed. A thump. From upstairs. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps? No, heavier. Harris held his breath. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight. He forced himself to move forward, each step a weight. Up the stairs. The floor creaked under his boots. The hallway at the top was darker, colder. The door at the end. It was slightly open. A whisper of movement inside. Was that a shadow? He couldn't tell. He moved closer. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The room was empty. Empty, except for the figure in the corner. Crouched. Unblinking eyes fixed on him. No noise. Just stillness. A wave of nausea hit him. The figure didn't move. Not even when he backed away. Not even when he reached for his radio again. Nothing. Only silence. And then, the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. Behind him. He froze. The dragging sound was slow, deliberate. It scratched against the hardwood, like something heavy, something scraping. He turned, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hallway was empty. The door behind him was still ajar. But there was something different now. A figure had appeared in the doorway. A tall, thin silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. Its head tilted, almost as if examining him. Harris took a step back, his chest tight. The air felt thick, suffocating. His throat burned as he swallowed, but his legs wouldn't move. He wanted to reach for his gun, but his hand didn't respond. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, staring. The dragging sound came again. Closer now. He glanced back at the figure, its hands, long and thin, reaching out from the darkness. The fingers stretched impossibly far, like they were coming for him. He finally moved. His feet carried him backward, but the door behind him wouldn't open. It wouldn't budge. The figure in the doorway stepped forward. The air seemed to bend, distort. Its movements were unnaturally smooth. Harris's mind screamed, but his body betrayed him. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was nothing. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by the soft creak of the floor beneath the figure's feet. Closer. Closer. Then, in a flash, it was right there, right in front of him. Its breath, cold against his face, smelled like rot. Harris stumbled back, the door still refusing to open. The figure reached out. Its fingers brushed his skin, ice cold, wet with something thick. He recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness around them deepened. The walls seemed to close in. And then, all at once, everything went black. Complete silence. Just the soft, almost imperceptible sound of breathing in the dark. And then nothing. The darkness was suffocating. It pressed against his chest, pushing the air out of his lungs. Harris couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The coldness lingered, wrapping itself around his limbs like chains. The silence was thick, oppressive. Then a sound. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, but it was there. Help. It was her voice. The woman. But it was wrong. It didn't sound like her. It was distorted, like it came from a distance, a depth he couldn't fathom. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The last thing he remembered. The figure. The touch. That cold, suffocating touch. He forced his eyes open. But there was no light. No warmth. Only the oppressive blackness. The whisper came again, this time louder. More urgent. Help me. He tried to scream. Nothing. His throat was dry, tight. His body refused to move. Then, slowly, the darkness shifted. A shape. Emerging from the void. A silhouette, familiar yet unrecognizable. It was her. The woman. But her eyes. They were wide open, unblinking, staring into nothingness. Her face was pale, stretched, her mouth hanging open as if trying to scream. But no sound came. The figure behind her moved. It was faster now, its shape twisting, contorting in the shadows. Harris's heart pounded in his chest, but he still couldn't move. The woman reached toward him. Her hand stretched, fingers twitching, crawling through the air like they were searching for something. For him. The blackness around them seemed to grow, to consume everything. And then, in the blink of an eye, the woman's face was inches from his. Her eyes locked onto his, vacant and hollow. Help me, she whispered again, but this time, it wasn't her voice. It was the voice of something much older. Something that had been waiting. Harris felt the coldness crawl into his veins, into his soul. The darkness swallowed him whole. And then nothing. His breath hitched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, alive, moving with a dark hunger. He could feel them creeping up his legs, his spine. Something cold grazed his neck. He froze, but the cold was growing, wrapping around him like chains. The voice, softer now, right behind him. Help me. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm wild and erratic. He turned, his body stiff, every muscle resisting. There was nothing there, just the walls. The hallway. The door still ajar. The blood. It soaked into the wood beneath his boots, dark and thick, pooling like a stain that wouldn't wash away. His flashlight flickered again, casting quick, erratic bursts of light across the room. And then he saw it. Just a glimpse. A shadow, too large, moving with unnatural grace. It darted across the hallway, disappearing into the dark. He reached for his radio. His fingers trembled as they fumbled for the buttons. Static. Nothing. The sound of dragging returned, scraping against the floor, sharp and unrelenting. It was coming from behind him again. Slow, deliberate. Closer. Closer. He spun around. The woman. She stood at the far end of the hall, her form almost unrecognizable now. Her head tilted to the side, her mouth hanging open wide, impossibly wide, as though her jaw had unhinged. Her eyes, those hollow eyes, stared at him, unblinking, dark as pits. And then there was the sound, not from her, but from the shadows, from the corners of the room. A low growl, deep and guttural. The floor creaked beneath it. A dark, twisted figure appeared in the hallway, crawling toward him. It was fast, faster than anything should move. Its limbs snapped at odd angles, its head jerking unnaturally, like it was disjointed, a puppet whose strings had snapped. Its mouth opened wide, wide enough to swallow him whole. The woman's voice joined the chorus. Help me. But it was no longer a plea. It was an order, a command, something cold pressed into his chest. Hands, long fingers, slick and wet, reaching from the shadows. Harris gasped, but no air filled his lungs. The walls were closing in. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him toward the darkness. He couldn't scream, couldn't move. The shadows felt like hands, tightening around his chest. His legs gave way. He collapsed to the floor, the darkness rising above him like a tide. The woman's face filled his vision again, her hollow eyes locked onto his, unblinking. Help me, she whispered one last time. And then, the darkness swallowed him whole. The world went silent. The cold, the shadows, they were gone. Harris couldn't feel anything anymore. No weight, no floor beneath him. Just endless, oppressive nothing. His body felt as though it had ceased to exist. His mind was blank, empty. Then a sudden sharp pain. A searing, burning sensation across his chest. It pulled him back, yanked him into awareness. He gasped, but there was no air. His lungs burned, desperate, clawing for a breath that wouldn't come. The pain, sharp and unyielding, grew worse. His fingers twitched, then his hands. He tried to move, tried to scream, but his throat was dry. There was no sound, only the sharp, stinging sensation that gnawed at him. And then he saw it. A sliver of light. Just a sliver. It flickered on the edges of his vision, faint and distant. He tried to reach for it. His body screamed in protest, but he forced his hand to move, stretching toward it. The pain was unbearable, but he couldn't stop. He had to reach it. Had to. The light grew brighter. It was blinding now, filling the empty space. For a moment, there was nothing but that blinding light. And then a voice. Low, calm, almost familiar. "Help me." He froze. It was the woman. But the voice was different this time. There was something more controlled. Something colder. Harris's heart skipped a beat. He turned. Slowly. The light flickered, casting harsh shadows across the room. And there she was again. The woman. But now, there was something else with her. A figure. Tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs twisted in angles that should not have been possible. Its face was hidden in darkness, but Harris could feel its eyes on him. Cold. Dark. Watching. The woman's smile stretched unnaturally wide. "Help me," she whispered again. But it wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation. An invitation into the void. The figure behind her moved closer, its presence suffocating, filling the space with its darkness. Harris couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. It was offering something worse. Something far worse. The sensation of being pulled, torn apart, and remade into something else. Something trapped. For eternity. The voices, now countless, joined in. A chorus of whispers, like nails scraping against glass. "Join us. Help us." The room, the void, everything began to warp. It was as if the very fabric of space was unraveling around him, stretching thin, becoming something alien, something wrong. The walls, the floor, the shadows, they all bent toward him, toward his soul. He felt his body being pulled apart from the inside, every part of him being torn free. And then, everything snapped. The darkness broke apart. Not into light, but into fragments. Fragments of memories. Fragments of lives. They scattered in every direction, like shards of broken glass. He saw them. The faces. The people who had been here before him. Trapped. Endlessly trapped in the same nightmare. He saw the woman, her face now fully gone, replaced by a hollow, skeletal smile. She reached out, but there was no more voice. No more plea. Just a silent invitation to join the ranks of the forgotten. Harris didn't know if he was still alive, or if he had ever been alive at all. All he knew was that he was no longer alone. The darkness, the void had claimed him. And now he was one of them. One of the lost. One of the forgotten. Forever. The silence was suffocating. It felt like time itself had forgotten him. There was no air. No warmth. Just an endless stretch of blackness that pressed against him from all sides. Harris's mind screamed, but his mouth was paralyzed. He couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Nothing existed but the feeling of being gone, of slipping through the cracks of reality and into something far worse than death. His body felt weightless, but also wrong. It was as though he was no longer solid, no longer human. Just a shadow, a whisper among the darkness. He tried to focus, to remember something, anything, that would bring him back to reality. But all he found was the overwhelming sensation of being watched. There was a presence here. Something ancient. Something that had been here long before him. And it was hungry. The sensation grew, crawling deeper into his thoughts. A low murmur, distant but close, vibrated through the very air. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, like the pulse of the earth itself. "Join us." The whisper echoed through the endless dark. But this time it was different. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a command. The shadows around him began to shift again. They twisted, swirling like a storm, stretching and folding. He could feel them grabbing at him, pulling, tugging. And then he saw it. A face. Not the woman's face, but something worse. Something that seemed to have no shape, no form. Only a swirling mass of void and teeth. Endless teeth. The face smiled, or, at least, it appeared to smile. A grin that stretched impossibly wide, stretching across the darkness itself. The eyes, empty black voids, locked onto him. And then it spoke. But it wasn't a voice. Not one he could understand. It was a sensation. A feeling that shot through his soul like a bolt of ice. Asterisk, you are not free. Asterisk. Harris's body shuddered. He couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't move. The void pressed deeper into him, like it was seeping into his very bones. And then the pull began. His skin felt tight, like it was stretching, like his very form was being ripped apart from the inside. He could feel himself unraveling. Not in the way a body decays, but in a way that was far more sinister. He felt his essence being torn from his physical form. His very being was being stripped away. Every memory, every shred of identity, every connection to who he once was, it was all being erased. He was no longer Harris. He was nothing. The dark mass moved again, swallowing him whole. He felt his last shred of awareness slipping away. But the last thing he saw was the woman's face. Her hollow eyes staring through him. Not in pity, not in sorrow, but in recognition. As if she had seen this before. As if this was always how it would end. And with one final, crushing pull, everything disappeared. Into nothing. There was only stillness. A vast, suffocating emptiness. No sense of time. No sensation of self. Nothing but the void. Harris couldn't tell if he was aware anymore. Was he still alive? Was he ever alive? A cold pressure settled over him, like a weight pressing into the deepest parts of his soul. Then, like a distant echo, a faint sound reached his mind. A whisper. Soft. Faint. But clear enough to make his chest tighten. "Join us." It was the same voice. The woman's voice. But it wasn't her. It never had been her. It was something older. Something far worse. The voice that shifted. It stretched, warped, became a chorus of others, mingling together, all calling to him in that same twisted, soothing tone. Asterisk, join us. Join us forever. You belong here. Asterisk. The coldness wrapped tighter around him, suffocating him from within. Harris tried to scream, but no sound came. Tried to move, but his body felt like it had turned to stone. The presence grew, thickening, swallowing every last bit of him. The shadows began to form around him, not just swirling but growing, reaching out like clawed hands. He could feel them, pulling him into themselves, tearing through his skin, his mind, his essence. He wasn't alone. The faces started to appear again. Those twisted, deformed faces, eyes wide, staring through him. They had been here for so long. Harris recognized some of them. Some were people who had come before. Some were faces he had never seen. But they all shared the same thing. Hollow eyes. Empty souls. Trapped here. Forever. His heartbeat was no longer his own. It was a part of something else. Something larger. Something that thrived in this dark place, feeding on the lost and the broken. Join us. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't a request. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a demand. And in that moment, Harris understood. This was never about helping. This was never about saving anyone. The woman, the figure, they were not victims. They were the ones who had called him here. They were the keepers of the void. The ones who had trapped so many others, each like him, drawn in by a promise of help, of salvation. And now it was his turn. His soul was not his own anymore. It belonged to the shadows, to the darkness, to the eternal.
He could feel it now.
The cold, the hunger, the infinite depth of this place. It wasn't a hell. It was something worse. Endless. There was no escape. No salvation. Only the hollow eyes. Only the endless waiting. And with one final breath, Harris slipped away. Into nothing. Forever. The emptiness swallowed him whole. No sound. No light. Just a vast, unrelenting void. Harris tried to focus, tried to push away the sensation of being gone, but there was nothing left to hold on to. His thoughts were fragments, shattered, scattered in the dark. He couldn't remember his name. He couldn't remember his body. He couldn't remember who he had been. But the cold was still there. The cold that seeped into his core, freezing the remnants of what had once been him. The void wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, a thing that touched him, that possessed him. Every flicker of his fading awareness was lost to it. His past was slipping away. His own essence was being devoured. And still, the whispers, endless whispers, murmuring from every corner of the dark. Join us. Asterisk, you are one of us now. Asterisk. It wasn't a question anymore.
It was a statement.
A fact. And he understood. He was one of them. He belonged to the dark. To the eternal emptiness. To the voices that had been here long before him, and would be here long after. The figures, twisted, broken shapes, hovered at the edges of his consciousness. They were watching him. The faces. They were waiting. Their hollow eyes, wide and empty, mirrored his own, as if they had always been a part of him. The woman's face, that skeletal grin, hovered before him again, her empty gaze locking with his. Her lips moved, though there was no sound. And yet he heard her words, not in his ears, but in his mind. Asterisk, you were always one of us. Asterisk. The weight of those words pressed down on him, heavier than any physical force. His soul was no longer his own. There was nothing left to escape, nothing left to fight. All that remained was the cold, the darkness, the endless chorus of voices. And then, the truth hit him like a wave. It was a truth far more terrifying than the shadows themselves. He had never been a victim. He had never been lost. He was a part of this place, a part of this eternity. The dark had always been inside him. It had been waiting. And now he was home. Harris's thoughts, once so frantic, grew quiet. The pull of the darkness was no longer a struggle. It was peaceful. It was right. He let go. And he joined the endless, the darkness, the forgotten. Time didn't exist here. There was no past, no future. Only now. Only the endless stillness. Harris drifted, not floating but sinking deeper into the void, if such a thing was even possible. His awareness, what was left of it, flickered like a dying ember, dimming with each passing second. But the voices, they never stopped. They were always there, a constant presence at the edges of his thoughts, filling the empty space like a thick fog. Their whispers never ceased. Join us. Asterisk, you belong here. Forever. Asterisk. It was a lullaby, one that soothed and suffocated all at once. He could feel them now. Asterisk, all of them, star. Those who had come before him, those who had been lost in this void. Their souls were tangled together, their whispers indistinguishable, blending into a cacophony of emptiness. He could see their faces, not with his eyes but with his mind. Not the faces of the living, not the faces of the people who had been here before him, but the faces of nothing. Hollow, eyes wide, staring, empty, like reflections in a broken mirror, shattered across infinite dimensions. The dark was alive. It knew him. It owned him. And as the darkness twisted around him, Harris finally understood. He was no longer a visitor. He was no longer an observer. He was a part of the void now. One of the faces, one of the voices. He could feel it. The change. Something inside him had cracked, split open, and merged with the endlessness around him. His essence, his very being, had melted into this place, becoming as much a part of it as the shadows themselves. He had become the darkness. There was no going back. There was no waking up. There was no escape. The woman's face, her hollow eyes, lingered at the edges of his awareness. She was still there. She had never left. She was him now, and he was her. Together, they drifted through the void, forever and ever. Not lost, not forgotten, but eternal, bound to the darkness, to the whispers, to the cold that had swallowed them all. And in the deepest corner of his fading thoughts, Harris felt something stir. A faint spark of recognition. A flicker of what he had once been. But it was fleeting. Gone before he could reach it. The last trace of his humanity slipped away. And with it, the last breath of his will. Now, he was only a part of the endless, a part of the eternal darkness. The void was his home, and he was its keeper. And there, in the suffocating silence, a change occurred. A shift. Not in the darkness itself, but in Harris. A recognition not of his past, not of what he had been, but of what he had become. A cold, terrifying awareness settled into his mind. It wasn't his mind anymore. It was the mind of the void, of the darkness. The whispers, the faces, the voices, they weren't just in his head.
They were him now.
They had always been him. Harris had become a part of the infinite, his essence mingling with those who had come before and those who would come after. And somewhere, deep within that endless pool of lost souls, he understood. The void didn't want to let go. It had always wanted him. It needed him, not just as a part of the darkness, but as a vessel, a keeper, a watcher. The faces around him shifted. Faces from every time, every place, and yet none of them were real. They were shadows of something that had never lived, something that had been forgotten long ago. And as their hollow eyes turned to him, as their whispers coiled tighter around his fading consciousness, Harris could feel his form fracturing. His body, his soul, his existence, they were no longer his own. He was becoming just another piece of the void, another flicker in the eternal darkness. The faces murmured to him, not in words but in feelings. Remember? The pulse of the void surged, like an answering heartbeat. Harris's sense of self faded. There was no need to remember anymore. There was no need for him. He was just another shadow now. A lost soul, wandering in the endless dark. A whisper among the infinite. The darkness had claimed him, and he would never leave. Not ever. The coldness grew, wrapping tighter around him, pulling him into its embrace. But this time, it wasn't terrifying. This time, it was comforting. He was part of something larger than himself. Part of something that had no beginning and no end. And as the darkness closed in around him, as the last vestige of his awareness slipped away, the final whisper came. Asterisk, you are one of us now. Asterisk. And with that, Harris became nothing. Just another lost soul in the eternal, infinite void. The silence was suffocating. Not a whisper. Not a breath. Just the endless stretch of darkness. Harris floated in it, lost. His body, his mind, no longer his own. The shadows around him were thick, pulsating with a slow, deliberate rhythm that almost felt like a heartbeat. But it wasn't his. It never had been. The feeling was familiar. Unsettling. He couldn't remember what it was like to be solid, to have weight, to breathe. All those things, life, existence, had become distant, like a forgotten dream. His thoughts were fragments, floating in the abyss. He knew something was wrong. Something deep inside him screamed for understanding, for a way out. But there was no escape here. No way back. Just the oppressive darkness, pulling him deeper, folding him into itself. The whispers returned.
Low. Constant.
Asterisk, join us. Asterisk. They weren't new voices. They were the same voices. The ones that had followed him since the moment he entered this place. The woman's voice. The figures. The ones that had been here before him. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. Their presence was always there, closer than he could bear. The longer he existed in this void, the more they seemed to fill him, like a memory that wasn't his, an identity he hadn't chosen. It claimed him. He was becoming one of them, a shadow, a whisper, a forgotten soul in an endless, consuming darkness. The void had its grip on him now, and there was no struggle left, no fight. It was just quiet. He could still hear their voices, but they didn't frighten him anymore. They were part of him. He was part of them. And with that final realization, the last of his humanity slipped away, dissolving into the dark. There was no more Harris, only the void. And as it closed around him, it felt complete. A circle that had no end. A place where nothing began and nothing ever truly ended. And in that place, Harris was no longer lost. He had become the darkness. And he would wait. Forever. The darkness enveloped him completely now. There was no sound, no movement. Just an endless stretch of emptiness. Harris couldn't remember what it was like to breathe, to feel, to exist in any way other than this suffocating stillness. The weight of it pressed down on him like a heavy fog, thick and unyielding, wrapping around his mind, squeezing every last bit of identity from him. He was no longer himself. The thought passed like a fleeting shadow, a fragment of something he used to know. But even that began to fade. The void had no need for him, no need for anyone. It didn't matter who they had been, what they had done, where they came from. Once here, all things were lost. All things were absorbed. The faces, the voices, the whispers. They all faded into the same endless hum, the same static lullaby that had been singing to him since he first stepped into this place. Join us. Help us. But those words didn't hold the same weight anymore. The pleading, the terror, it was all gone. There was no fear left to fuel his resistance. There was no fight left to give. And now, the whispers weren't just voices anymore. They were memories. The memories of everyone who had come before him, who had been drawn into this place, lost to the dark. Harris could see them now, not in their human forms, but as shadows. Faint, indistinct shapes that drifted in and out of his awareness. They weren't waiting. They weren't suffering. They were simply there. They had been reborn into this, into the dark, into forever. As the last trace of his humanity slipped away, Harris felt the pull again. Not a pull to return, but a pull to become. The shadows wrapped around him, tightening, integrating, making him one with them. His essence mingled with theirs, until it was no longer possible to tell where one ended and the other began. There was no more him, no more Harris, only the void, a place without time, without end, a place where nothing ever began or finished. And in that place, he was not lost. He was home, forever.